Well, I've been going over a lot of bad news lately. It's generally what I tend to talk about because that's what animates me the most. There isn't too much, in world affairs that I think there is to be happy about in this day and age. I'm generally a pretty pessimistic guy when it comes to, mainstream politics. However, there is, here and there, a positive story from time to time. And so I would like to thank the Iranian people for giving me something positive to talk about today. And that is that the Iranians are joining in with the mass protests that are going on in many countries. Of course, this weekend we had, I guess, four major countries you could say that where there were big protests like this. You had Iran, you had Bolivia, Chile, and the Yellow Vests, and France. And of course, I went over yesterday, while on the 1 year anniversary of the Yellow Vests, why I wasn't, I'm not too optimistic for them when it comes to the future. I don't think that much is going to come of that because they've been, I think that they've been not defeated but resisted by the French establishment, and I won't go over my reasoning behind that again. And of course, the protests in Chile and Bolivia aren't really interesting to me because I don't really think there's any good guys there. Am I a big fan of the Chilean government? No, but I mean the people who are, protesting the Chilean government generally want something that's much worse than the establishment. They want to go back to a more left-wing regime, which, Chile is the richest country in Latin America. It's not a bad place to live. It's certainly much better than, say, living in Mexico or Cuba. But you've got all these cringe Zoomers down there that they just love Castro, and they romanticize the government that was overthrown by the coup of Pinochet, and so they see all this modern wealth and stuff that Chile has as symbols of Pinochet, which. Again, am I a big fan of the current Chilean government? No, I mean they're not my kind of people, but they're better than the alternative. Sure, they're basic, they're pretty basic, boring neoliberals like you have in Europe or North America, but that's better than Latin American socialists. That's better than the Chavistas and like the former government of Bolivia that was just overthrown in a coup. So I guess that's a good segue to Bolivia. Their movement, I mean, I understand, coups are bad. I don't think the CIA should have done a coup against Morales. None of our business. That's their country. But again, I'm not too excited to see, left-wingers rising up against, some military regime. It doesn't really animate me. I don't like either side. I don't like commies, and I don't like military dictators. So sue me. But here in Iran, in Iran, there's not really a defined side yet. They're just sort of against something. And they're against something that I don't like, which is the Iranian government. I don't like really any government, on the face of the planet. And so until a protest movement sort of defines itself as something that, is worse than the existing regime, I tend to support any protests or violent uprising against any government in the world. Because that spirit of resistance against the government is itself a good thing and something that should be nurtured and maintained. It is good for people to be skeptical of their government and to not have faith in them. The last thing you want are people who worship the state, like we have here in the United States, to where no one can even think of breaking the law, no matter whether the law is just or not. That's beside the point. The point is that an authority figure told you not to do that, so how dare you? That sycophantic bootlicker attitude. That enrages me more than anything. So seeing people out in the streets, even if they don't necessarily, believe the same things that I do, or have, or make, some bad mistakes, like destroying private property in the case of the Yellow Vests, I'm happy to see that the spirit of resistance against the state is alive and well. And speaking of the Yellow Vests, these Iranian protests are, somewhat reminiscent of the Yellow Vests in the way they started, at the very least, and that being that this started over a gas tax hike. Now, Iran is a petroleum exporting country and a member of OPEC, so they have heavily subsidized gas prices in Iran. It's much cheaper than it is here, I'm sure, although I don't know exactly how much gas is in Iran. But obviously, anytime the government wants to raise the gas tax, you're going, or I guess they're reducing the gas subsidy, because I'm pretty sure, fuel is heavily subsidized in a country like Iran. You're going to spark outrage from people, because people don't like prices going up arbitrarily because the government just decided to do it. And that's going to enrage pretty much anyone that drives a car, which is, a pretty broad swath of the electorate in most countries. And like the Yellow Vest movement, which was also a protest against a gas tax hike, this Iranian protest seems to, at least, I don't know to what extent it's being hijacked by people, outside of Iran who are trying to sort of impute values onto this movement that that don't exist. But it seems pretty clear to me that this is more of a general movement against the government, because they're doing things that aren't necessarily associated with the gas tax. It's not like, hey, we love our government, but we just hate this gas tax and all and everything that that you're seeing as a response to that. We're seeing a lot of stuff that shows that they're just generally fed up with their current administration. The most notable example of which, something that really warmed my heart yesterday and made me very proud of the Iranians, was that they burned down their central bank, which is a tremendous act of defiance against the state, because, of course, I've talked about it on this channel before, but the central bank really is the locus of oppression in the modern governmental system. The modern states really could not survive if they didn't have control over the financial system in the way that they do through the central banking system and the way that they've cartelized, financial intermediation. Essentially, having a central bank allows a government to print cheap money for itself and for its friends, to make its activities cheaper, and to essentially steal money from the ordinary people without having to raise their taxes. It's a stealth redistribution of wealth. When the central bank decides to, set low interest rates by pumping money into the banking system, to lower the rates so that, say, the government can borrow money at a cheaper rate and run up a higher deficit, that money doesn't come for free. They get that money. The value in that money has to be stolen from the existing money in circulation. So they have to devalue the money of ordinary people, people who try and save their money. Maybe they're trying to save up to buy a house or a car or something. Your money in the bank is getting eroded away. And then they take that money and they spend it on the government, which oppresses you and tells you what to do and taxes you even more and sends jackbooted thugs into your house over, a little bag of weed that somebody said they smelled next door. Or, specifically in the case of Iran, that funds, moral police who will throw you, put you in jail or write you a ticket for not wearing a headscarf. And without a central bank, it's not like government, would just go away. It wouldn't, but it would have to pay for its own bills, directly. It would have to either, pay for its bills by taxing people or by running deficits and having to, pay real interest on it with real money. That's what happened during the time of the gold standard, in the late 19th century until World War I. And back then, even the most powerful and imposing governments on the world, say the German Empire or Great Britain, they were exceedingly less oppressive to their people, because they just, they couldn't afford to, create a totalitarian state like we saw, like we would see during the 1930s. Now, of course, not to get too off topic, but yes, even in the late 19th century, we did have central banks, but they weren't operating on a fiat money standard. It was a little different. They weren't nearly as powerful as they are now. But as of now, central banks pretty much the biggest threat to mankind. So burning that down, that shows that these people are super based, and that they know what's going on. Now, speaking of people who are based and red-pilled, supposedly, I saw a lot of, well, not a lot, but a few alt-right people who were very upset that the Iranians burned down their central bank. And that's because they were saying, no, you guys don't understand. the Iranian central bank isn't controlled by the Jews. It's one of the few banks that aren't. So that's actually a good central bank, because you see, central banking is only bad when the Jews do it. Now, I've heard this characterization thrown around for years because people have called me, some kind of Jew hater because I'm against central banking. And I always thought that was the most ridiculous smear in the world. But lo and behold, apparently there are actually people who believe that. People who only, oppose central banking because Jews do it. So, I don't know. It's a big world out there. Now, I think it's no coincidence that we're seeing protests all around the world, over the last couple of years, that are looking very similar to one another. The Yellow Vest being the most notable example, which has been buried in the press the most. But I think that the modern internet age, we really haven't seen an age of revolution since the time of the internet. But I think that it's much more easy for this sort of activity to go viral than it used to. Obviously, because we're so much more well connected. The people in Iran can see what's going on in Bolivia and Paris and in Santiago. In Chile, and they can, and they get the idea in their head of doing the same thing, and then, the more that this keeps happening in more countries, it's going to keep spreading to more and more, and lead to more and more civil unrest and more people, getting upset at their government, and even people who have very different ideas and different goals, but all agree that, hey, we don't like our government, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. It's very similar to what happened, of course, not on nearly the scale yet. To what happened in Europe in 1848. The revolutions of 1848 were very interesting and significant in human history because you had revolutions against governments all across Europe, or all around the same time, and it's just it was like a fire, it was like a virus, it was the spirit of revolution spreading throughout the continent and infecting all sorts of peoples who had pent up angst against their governments. Now, of course, seeing all this, a lot of people have been asking, hey, when are things going to kick off in the United States? Because, we've all been talking here in America about how polarized the country is and how, we've never seen things like this to where people are so intolerant of each other's political views. When are we going to start seeing a mass protest movement? And frankly, I'm not so sure that that's going to happen here because what's going on in America is very different from, the populist revolutions in the other countries. Partially because of the victory of Donald Trump, people do not feel that there is, such a disconnect between, who's running the country and, this underlying populist angst, because there are a lot of Trump supporters who look at Trump and that relieved a lot of their angst because they think, okay, well now someone like me is in the White House. Now, of course, I don't really agree with that assessment. But let's just say that things would have been, we would have had a much more similar feeling in this country to say like what there is in France right now had Hillary Clinton won, because then you would have had left and right enraged because nobody liked Hillary Clinton. The left, the far left does not like her. No one on the right likes her, and so there would have been very easily been the seeds there for some kind of populist uprising, similar to what we're seeing in Paris. But with Trump, what he's managed to do is polarize the country more, but not polarize them against the state, against the government itself, but against each other. And so because of this polarization, people are much more, angry at, say, the left or the right, depending on what side they happen to find themselves, than they are at the government itself. So general protests, wanting the overthrow of the United States government, it doesn't make sense in this context. Which is unfortunate for someone like me who is, sort of on the collapsitarian spectrum and thinks that, civil unrest and, ultimately the dissolution of the Union, the disenfranchisement of Washington, the breaking up of that monopoly, is the only solution that we have to restoring civil tranquility in this country. To get people no longer angry at each other, what they need is to have a way to express themselves and control their own homelands. Their own places where they live, their own communities, and not have to worry about what's going on in Washington. But with that said, even though all this angst in the United States is not targeted as much at the government itself, this is still sort of fertile ground for some sort of unrest. It's just going to be different. We're not going to have something that is exactly like the Yellow Vests, where you see left and right coming together to oppose the state. We're not going to have that kind of unity here. However, I do expect to see partisan unrest coming, during the 2020 election cycle and thereafter, no matter who wins, because I think that, that's only going to ramp up the tension even more. Now, will that be enough to start breaking things and making the whole system come apart? Well, we don't know that yet. I don't think you really know until the moment it happens, kind of like with the fall of the Soviet Union. Someone like me, even in the 80s, I would have been saying that, hey, the Soviet system is unsustainable, and so it's going to collapse eventually, but I could never tell you when. It's just like what, with the economy. The economy and politics are not that different from each other. They are both, social, they're both a part of social science. So a lot of times you can use, the same sort of methodology to examine both of those things. And as I've said about the economy, it is unsustainable, the path that we are on, of just increasing all the debt in the system exponentially year after year. However, I cannot give you a precise date on, when the day of reckoning will come and all that will just crumble and fall apart. So with that said, I think I'll end things off here. And if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.